Hi guys, welcome back to another sewing tutorial video. Today I'll be teaching you how to sew circular and flared hems. We'll be learning how to make hand sewn and machine sewn hems. You'll see this type of hem on everything from skirts, dresses, blouses, coats and jackets. It's important to follow a few steps when hemming these types of garments, as the hem can distort with time and ruin the look of your work. The hem is one of the features of the garment which really catches the eye, so this is an essential sewing technique. I hope you'll give it a try, and let's get started. For this tutorial, I've made two dresses to show how to make circle and flared hems. For the circle skirt, I've made Vogue 1102. You can see from the outline of the pattern that the skirt pieces make a quarter circle, while the entire skirt makes a whole circle. For the flared dress, I've sewn up buttock 6284. If you have a look at the bottom of the skirt pieces on the outline, they are slightly curved. This is more pronounced when the gathers are sewn. The dresses are complete except for the hem. Now you need to decide what hem allowance you need to use for the garment. This table can help you decide the hem allowance and the type of hem for your garment. Generally, the closer the skirt is to a circular hem, the less hem allowance should be used. The type of hem is up to you. For circle skirts, it's best to make narrow rolled hems, which removes all excess fabric. If you're following a pattern like I am, check the bottom of the garment piece. For the circle skirt, I'm using hem allowance of 1.5 cm for both the main fabric and lining. For the flared skirt, I'm using a hem allowance suggested by the pattern, which is 8.2 cm. Don't forget to iron the full garment so they'll hang properly when we level the hem. If you're sewing a skirt, dress, blouse, jacket or coat, then you'll need to level the hem. Hang the garment for at least 24 hours on a coat hanger or on your dress form. Some sewing books mention hanging it for a week. Over time, the bias or diagonal of the fabric will stretch and distort your nice straight hem. By hanging it up beforehand and leveling the hem, we can prevent this. This is particularly important for circular and flared skirts, as the hem can droop by a lot over time. Next, we need to measure an even hem. For the best results, you need a dress form. Hang and pin the garment to the dress form. Make sure that you adjust the dress form to the garment size. If you have a waist seam, it should be straight. Note that the waistline of my dress dips in the back, so I'm just judging it by the front section. Adjust the hem gauge to the height of the shortest raw edge of the garment. This is generally the centre back or a side seam. My hem gauge has a notch in the middle. I'm going to adjust it so that the raw edge runs through this notch. Now we can start measuring the hem. Turn the dress form so that the garment runs through the hem gauge. Make sure that the garment is straight, but don't try to pull the garment down. Let it hang naturally. If the raw edge falls below the notch, then place a pin at the notch. The pin represents where the new raw edge needs to be cut. Try and place the pin at least every 5 cm. Keep doing this all the way around the garment. Once you're done, you'll have a nice straight line of pins to show you where you need to cut. I'm going to go ahead and level the lining as well. I'm going to bring up the main skirt to the bodice and pin it. The centre back has a zipper, so I'm not going to pull up the main skirt so high so that the lining still hangs free. Make sure the lining looks straight. Adjust the hem gauge to the shortest raw edge and go ahead and pin and level the hem. Take the garment off the dress form and bring it to your table. Lay out the bottom raw edge so that you're just dealing with one layer. Grab a curved ruler and some tailor's chalk. Use your ruler to connect the pins. Draw a line with your tailor's chalk over the top and take out the pins. A curved ruler works best for circle skirts, but for my flared dress I used a straight ruler to draw over the pins. I adjusted it every few inches to make sure that it's following the curve. Use whichever ruler matches the curve of your project. Once you're done, you can cut over the top with the tailor's chalk. You should have a nice level hem now. I'm going to repeat this for the lining as well. For the lining of my circle dress, I'll be making a machine sewn hem. This method of sewing can be used for circle, flared and A-line garments. It's the best type of hem to use for linings and unfussy hems. The first thing I need to do before I hem the lining is to cut off the excess seam allowance at the end of the skirt seams. This will help prevent any bulkiness at the seams. I'm going to make a marking at 1.5 centimeters, which is the hem allowance. I'm then going to cut off about half of the seam allowance below this point. The hem is nice and level, so I'm going to go ahead and finish the raw edge with my overlocker. I'm sewing over the top of the raw edge and not cutting off any extra fabric. At your sewing machine, change your thread to a contrasting colour for both the top and the bobbin. Change your stitch length to the maximum on the straight stitch. Pull out some thread from the machine before and after you sew. Do not backstitch. Grab your lining. We need to sew an easing stitch near the raw edge. The easing stitch will help gather in the excess fabric at the raw edge and prevent tucks. I'm going to start sewing on the hem and finish at the other hem. I'm using a seam allowance of around 1 centimeter, which will create an easing stitch just below the overlocking. Sew the easing stitch for just one section of the skirt. Once that's done, pull the fabric out of the machine and leave a long tail. Take the dress over to the ironing board. I'm going to be using a hem allowance of 1.5 centimeters for the lining, so I'm going to fold up the raw edge by this length on the wrong side and press with my iron. You might be tempted to fold away the finished edge to make a double fold hem, but this isn't suitable for circle skirts. Double fold hems can create more bulk and distort the hem. Iron the hem up for all of the garment. Gently pull the thread as you hold the fabric. The fabric will start to gather underneath your fingers. Spread out the gather over the whole section of the skirt. We're aiming to make the finished edge slightly wavy, but not properly gathered, so you shouldn't see any tucks. You can use the steam function on your iron to help press out the curve. Once you're done, you can pin the hem. Take your dress over to the sewing machine, change your stitch length back to normal and use a matching thread. Sew on top of the hem. I'm using a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. This will look straight and consistent, and the seam will also be hidden in the overlocking when it is sewn. Sew all the way around the skirt. Use a quick unpick to remove the easing stitch. And you're done! This is an easy method to hem linings and looks really neat from the right side. Today I'll be hand sewing a narrow rolled hem with a blind stitch. This type of hem adds a couture touch to your garment because the stitching is almost invisible from both sides of the garment, plus the raw edge is hidden away. This type of hem is perfect for circular skirts. It's only suitable for thin fabrics which won't have hard use. The hem allowance for this skirt will be 1.5 centimeters. So I'm going to go ahead and make markings at this allowance on top of the skirt seams. I'm then going to cut off the excess seam allowance to remove bulk. We won't be finishing the raw edge for this type of hem. At this point you need to do a little maths on how to work out the seam allowances to use. The final hem will be around 5 millimeters. You can make this narrower if you're using a thinner fabric than me. On top of the fold we need to sew the easing stitch. Because my hem allowance is 1.5 centimeters, I'm going to sew the easing stitch at 1 centimeter seam allowance. Change the stitch length to the maximum on the straight stitch and sew the easing stitch on each section of the garment, or the skirt sections in my case. Leave long tails of thread at each end. Bring the garment over to the ironing board. Fold up the raw edge so that the easing stitch is on the fold, or 1 centimeter in my case. I'm going to pull the easing in a little so that the folded edge is a little wavy. Since the hem is narrow, it doesn't need to be eased in heavily. Next, we need to carefully trim off as much of the seam allowance as possible. Make sure that you move the threads aside for the easing stitch so that you don't accidentally cut them off. I'm cutting as close as 2 millimeters from the easing stitch. Bring the hem over to the ironing board again. Fold up the hem by 5 millimeters on the wrong side. It should be easy to roll under the raw edge so that the easing stitch is on top. Press into place with your iron and pin. Do this for the entire hem of the garment. Now we'll use a blind stitch to make an invisible hem. Grab a needle and thread. To sew a blind stitch, you need to use a single strand of thread. Thread a needle with about an arm's length of thread and then cut. I'm using a square knot at one of the ends. Push the needle through the seam allowance on the wrong side so that it will be hidden. Do this at one of the seams. Make a small stitch through the seam allowance of the garment and the fold of the hem. Pull the needle through. Repeat this stitch a few times. This type of stitch is called an overhand stitch, and I'm using it to help anchor the beginning of my sewing. Now we can sew the blind hem. The first stitch is made into the fold of the hem. Push the needle through the fold and slide it along for about 1/2 centimeter. Pull the needle through. Now I'm going to make a tiny stitch into the wrong side of the fabric. This stitch needs to be directly opposite of where the thread came out of the hem. Pick up just a thread or so from the fabric and pull through. Push the needle into the fold of the hem again. Make a stitch directly opposite of the last stitch and use a stitch length of about 1/2 centimeter and pull through. Keep repeating these stitches for all of the hem. When you reach the end of your hem, you need to make a knot. Make a small stitch somewhere where a knot won't be noticeable. Pull the thread down to a small loop. Pass the needle through the loop 3 times. Pull the needle and a knot will form at the base. Repeat once, then cut off the thread. The hem is all done. Use a quick unpick to remove the easing stitch. This type of narrow hem is nearly invisible from both sides and not bulky. The raw edge is folded away and looks really neat. Moving on to hemming the flared dress. For this dress, I'll be showing how to make a hidden slip stitch hem. This hem is more versatile and is suitable for thicker fabrics. I've also leveled the hem of the flared dress with the same process as the circle skirt. The hem for this dress is 8.2 centimeters. At each of the seams, I'm making a marking at about 8.2 centimeters from the edge. I'm then going to cut off at least half of the seam allowance below this marking to remove the excess fabric. I then went ahead and finished the raw edge and sewed the easing stitch about 1 centimeter below the finished edge. I sewed one set of easing stitches for each section of the skirt to clinch together the extra fabric. Even if there isn't too much excess fabric for this hem, I'm pulling the easing in slightly to create small ripples and to tighten up the fabric. I'm taking the dress over to the ironing board and folding up the finished edge by this hem allowance or 8.2 centimeters on the wrong side. I'm then going to press the fold with my iron. If you have a long hem like me, make sure to pin about 2 centimeters from the finished edge and parallel. This will help you keep the hem in place as you work near the finished edge. The hem is all ironed and pinned and is ready to be hand sewn. I'm going to hem this skirt with a hidden slip stitch. Thread your needle with a single strand of thread, not the other end. The key to sewing this type of hem is to fold back the finished edge by 1 centimeter. The pin should help you do this if it's placed right. Grab your needle. I'm going to insert into the seam allowance of the skirt and pull through. I'm then going to do a few overhand stitches between the fold and a small stitch into the seam allowance. Now we can start sewing the hidden slip stitch. On the wrong side of the skirt, I'm going to make a small horizontal stitch that picks up just a few threads of the fabric near the fold of the hem, then pull through. The next stitch is made on the folded back of the hem. Make another tiny stitch in the fold. The length between the stitches should be about 5 millimeters. Make the next tiny stitch into the wrong side of the skirt with a stitch length of about half a centimeter. Keep repeating this pattern. As you sew, try not to pull the thread too tight as this will make dimples on the right side. Sew the hem of the entire garment. When you reach the end, knot off the same as the other hand sewing. Pass the needle through the loop 3 times and pull down. Repeat once and cut off the thread. Once you're done, you can take out the pins and flip up the finished edge. Use a quick unpick to pull out the easing stitches. And the hem is all done. The right side of the skirt has barely visible stitches and the stitching is hidden inside the hem. You can still see the finished edge, but the overlocking looks tidy. Thanks for joining me in this sewing tutorial video. Today we learned how to make perfect circular and flared hems. We learned how to neaten and level the bottom of the hem and also 3 neat and easy ways to sew the hem. I hope you'll give this a try for your next sewing project. Thanks for watching. Come on, sew my lap. Aww. I hope to see you then. Hello. Scoot out. Shh.